Hey guys, how's it going? Kermode here. Welcome to another tutorial. In this video, I want to show you guys how you can save headroom in your mix, and specifically 10 different tips to save headroom in the mix. Now, for those of you that don't know what headroom is, I'm going to give you a very brief summary. Headroom is essentially the amount of volume you can potentially have in a song. So when you hear the term, oh, it's saving you headroom, or you need more headroom, what they're saying is you need to essentially save volume, save energy in the song. Think of energy. And your goal with a mix, or at least one of the aspects of the goals of a mix, is to achieve maximum volume using the minimum amount of voltage. So you have the maximum perceived volume with the minimum amount of energy used. So when you hear people saying, how do I get my master louder? How do I get my master louder? A lot of it is about saving headroom, saving energy. This is especially important nowadays in electronic music, where you have to have a very competitive, loud master, especially for when you're DJing, because you're going to be, when a DJ plays your music, it's going to be paired up against very well engineered, very well mastered, very loud music. And if yours doesn't compare, DJs aren't going to play your music. It's not going to have the same impact in a club, and it's just not really going to get the traction you want. So without further ado, let's dive right into it. So the first tip I want to give you guys is to be careful of plugins and effects that mess up and alter the phase of your sound. Now, what does that look like? So let's jump over to Ableton here, and I'm going to grab a bass sound. This problem becomes really prominent in sounds with low frequencies. So I have a weird bass sound here. And let's say hypothetically, I wanted to remove the low end of this sound. Now let's see what its peak volume is. So right now it's peaking at minus 3.3 decibels. Now, if I were to add an EQ on here, because I wanted to remove the low end, which is something people do quite often, EQ8 can sometimes mess up the phase of the low end and actually increase the overall volume, especially when you use a steeper curve. So let's see what happens to our peak volume as we start to hike this up. So you saw there, if I take a step back right here, our sound's actually peaking a whole decibel louder, even though we're technically removing frequencies. So you have to be really careful with how you're removing lows in sounds, because sometimes you're not actually saving the energy you think you're saving. It's actually just kind of rotating the phase of the sound and actually expelling more energy. So my recommendation as a solution for this is just to, be very careful, watch your meters, and also maybe consider using a linear phase EQ or a natural phase EQ, such as Pro Q3. And this also can come into play with other plugins, so just be careful. Just notice how effects and plugins change the rotation of the phase of your sound and the metering. So now that you're aware that these plugins can cause problems and you can work around them, the next tip I have for you guys is cutting ultra lows and cutting ultra highs. Now, I should be very clear, you should not always cut ultra lows and cut ultra highs out of sounds, but there are a lot of sounds that have ultra lows and ultra highs that you really don't need in there, that are just sucking up headroom in the mix. So let me grab a bunch of cymbals. Let's throw EQ8 on. Look at this. All these closed hat samples have insane amounts of lows in them. So let me just delete this, and let's just work with this one closed hat. So notice this huge amount of sub and low end in the closed hat. We technically don't need this in the sound. This is just creating unnecessary headroom loss. So what we can do is we can remove that, but pay attention to the meters when you do. So this is peaking at plus 1.31. Let's turn this down a little. So we're peaking at minus 1.69. And if I were to turn this on, let's see what happens. Can we save ourselves headroom? Notice how up until this point, it's actually only increased the volume of the sound, going back to step 1. So it didn't really save us huge amounts of headroom. So this might be a time when we want to actually get Pro Q3, turn on natural phase, and let's see if we actually do save headroom in this case. So notice me switching from natural phase, which was peaking at -1 here, or 0 latency, which was -1 as well, up to linear phase, how we just saved ourselves half a decibel of headroom. Now your computer's not necessarily going to be able to handle all these different linear phase modes of EQs on just things like hi-hats. Sometimes you have to make sacrifices and lose a bit of headroom. But in this case, you know, it did save us some headroom. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut out the ultra lows, because everything below 328 for a hi-hat is pretty unnecessary. You don't really need that frequency in this hi-hat. Though when I'm referring to ultra lows, I'm usually referring to rumble below anything audible around 24 Hertz. In this case, we're going to do a bit higher, but when I'm referring to ultra lows, you're going to want to cut around here on a sound, which could still save you headroom. Now the same goes for ultra highs. A lot of samples have content that go above the audible hearing range. Most often humans, we're not going to hear anything above a certain range anyways. So quite often you can save a bit of headroom by cutting that out. Again, similarly, not saying you should always cut out these ultra highs, but in some cases you really don't need it in the sound. Now something like a hi-hat, you might want that highs, but you know, something that's a little further back in the mix or something else, you might want to take that out. But let's just see, let's just cut this out. Let's see if we even hear a difference, and let's see if it even affects the headroom. So just going down ever so slightly, you'll notice we dropped from -1.5 already to -1.7 just from doing that. Next up, what I want to talk about is being cognizant of the phase of a sound, as well as the phase interaction between sounds, because this can really change a lot in the mix. First, I'm going to talk about being cognizant of the original phase of the sound. And what I'm talking about is as you're doing sound design or you're picking sounds, how harmonics interact with one another will actually affect the overall loudness and potentially even peak volume of the sound. Let me show you what I mean. So if I were to take operator here in Ableton, and I were to introduce a harmonic, let's say the third harmonic above it. Something like this. And then let's run this through an oscilloscope. So we have an oscilloscope here. We can see what our waveform looks like. And you'll notice that there's a specific peak volume in the way that the relation between the two harmonics are occurring. If I undo that, we're peaking at -8.5. Now, if we were to rotate the phase of the third harmonic here, notice how we have a completely different looking waveform. And our peak volume right now is completely different. It's the two same sine waves playing, but because of the offset of timing, even if it's fractions of a fraction of a fraction of a second, even that slight phase rotation is going to completely change the phase of the volume of your sound. So it's very important to be cognizant of, if you're layering synths, if you're layering harmonics, how are they interacting, and how does a slight rotation affect the volume of your sound? So this kind of just goes to show that not all subs and, harmonic subs are exactly the same. You could have, you could always add a third harmonic into your sine wave, but if you don't pay attention to the phase of it, you're actually going to be creating a weaker, less dominant sub compared to a sub where you are cognizant of that. And then that takes me to the second part of this point, which is being cognizant of phase interaction. So not only does this have to do with the source sound, but this can also do with any sort of layering that's going on as well. So let's say hypothetically this was the sub of my bass, and then I added some sort of serum layer on top of that. Now notice how every time I play this saw with this sub, the peak volume is different. And the reason for this is because right now the saw phase starting point is coming out random every single time. So we're going to essentially be having a completely random start point, and we're never going to achieve the same result. So when you're using really pure waveforms, it's really important to not randomize the phase and really strategically line them up. If you have synthesizers that are starting with random phase, which you're going to have because it's not always the right move to have a perfectly accurately 100% starting the same way synthesizer, what I recommend doing is at the end of a song, freezing and flattening every element and lining them up to be exactly the way you want. So let's say, for example, we had a bunch of C's going on our two sounds here. Or let's do a bunch of E's. And let's have them repeat quite regularly. You can hear each one of those bass hits was completely different. So what I like to do at the end of a song is freeze and flatten all my synthesizers and really pick the ones that just interact together the nicest, where their cycles achieve the result and the headroom balance that I want, or avoid the cancellation of frequencies that I don't want. Now, obviously, you don't want things going down into sub frequencies anyways, because this is why this sort of cancellation is occurring. But this is even important for bouncing your synthesizers at the end and picking the one that lines up with your kick drum the most, for example. If I were to grab a kick here, and we don't need all this low end in it, but let's say we had a short kick like this one, and we zoomed way in on our sine wave here, well, you can see this, for the most part, is pretty out of phase. It starts really in phase and then really quickly gets out of phase with our sub. So first of all, you're going to want to be doing some sidechain, which is actually a future point, but also you're going to want to be aligning. So if we're only hearing the sub come in at this point, then we want it to be aligned with our kick drums so they aren't necessarily canceling, which would technically be saving headroom but ruining your sounds. So what we're going to want to do is, shift these so we achieve the right loudness. So at the end of a mix, I'll probably do something like this instead of something like this, because that cancellation and dip might affect the loudness. And I'm just very cognizant of all the phases of my sounds and how they're interacting, especially if anything that has low frequencies in it. The lower the frequencies, the more you really have to start caring about how the phase of all these sounds are lining up. Now, this brings me to my next point, which is doing aggressive sidechain compression, or what I even prefer to do is manual fading. So let's say hypothetically we were to compress this sub bass out of the way when the kick happens. And I'm going to do it quite aggressively. So let's freeze that. Let's flatten that. And you can see that does a pretty good job, but it's also just this weird gap and we didn't quite have the control over it I wanted. Now, I would say that this is cleaner and better for headroom than something like this, for example, where you can see, although I sidechain compress the sound, notice how there's still content in here. That sub isn't fully out of the way. And a lot of times when you're sidechaining, you're not sidechaining as aggressive as I just did. And there's going to be a lot of crossover, especially when your ratio isn't infinite. You're immediately going to get into this sort of territory here. Well, that's still a problem. You know, your sub and your kick are still going to play together, interact together in ways you don't want. So what I do, and I really love doing, and I recommend doing, is manually fading sounds out of the way, because you can visually see once something has started to fade out, once something's started to fade in, and you get this near perfect sidechain where you saw when I went full aggression, it didn't really come in till here, and you hear that gap. When I did kind of weak sidechain, it was that, which isn't doing anything. But when you have full control over it, you can almost create the perfect volume envelope. Now, this is going to take a lot of time, but you know, saving headroom isn't something you can just do quick shortcuts with. You want to be, you know, very cognizant of everything you do, and this is just one of those ways. Now that leads me to my next point, which is one transient to rule them all. What does that mean? Well, you know, let's say, for example, I had a house track. In every other kick drum, I had a clap. So what we have going on is in our mix, we have a kick hitting, 3 different clap layers. And, you know, quite often what people will do is they'll have, you know, some sort of bass sound hitting at the same time, or synthesizer, a nice pluck synth. And although sometimes conceptually it sounds really good to you, this is going to do a lot of damage to your peak volume, because what's going to happen is all these transients, the loudest part of a sound, are going to be hitting at the exact same time. So I like to have this kind of mentality, which is called one transient to rule them all, which is at any given time in a song, I usually want maybe 1 or 2 sounds maximum to have a fully aggressive transient. So if you have an ARP and you have a bass and you have a kick and you have a hi-hat, maybe only a couple of those have a full transient and the other one's a little bit softer and pushed out of the way. So what I like to do is go in and decide, you know, what is going to be creating that high-end thwack at this sound. And usually what I do is I solo and I just pick the one with the nicest transient. That one's got a pretty nice transient. So does the kick drum. So I could go either way, and this kick drum isn't starting immediately where it is, where it's supposed to. So let's do that real quick. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to pick one of them and I'm going to fade the others out of the way. So maybe what I'll do is I'll do something like this. And because this has low end in it, I'm going to keep the kick transient. But I'm going to take away these transients. And let's see what that does to our headroom. So let's play this here. So we're peaking at plus 0.2. And let's play this here. We're peaking at minus 1.5, and it's almost inaudible. And in fact, I personally like this because I think it's better to have 1 or 2 clear, distinct transients than a bunch of transients that all play at once and end up masking one another. Now, some of us aren't so lucky. You might not have the ability to freeze flatten and remove all these transients manually. So a cool little trick I use in certain contexts is actually I'll add a gate onto a sound. And what a gate does is anything below the threshold gets turned down to the floor volume. So if it's minus infinite, anything below this gets turned down minus infinite. Now what's kind of cool is with a gate, the attack time is how long does it take to go from minus infinite back to its volume. And what you can do is you can actually just add attacks to sounds. Notice how we cut out the transient there? Now, fair warning, if your sounds are very close together, they'll end up staying over the threshold and the transients will come back suddenly. So it's not good for sounds that end up close together, or if you're doing a build up in a song. But if it's a clap that's super spaced like this, then yeah, you could just not even have to manually draw fades. You could actually just use a gate, put on here too. And that probably did the same thing. That actually even removed more of the transient, but we kept the nice body and character of those drums. Now we're going to get into some more fundamental tips, and first of which is compression and limiting, which is really obvious, but not enough people are doing subtle amounts of compression, subtle amounts of limiting to kind of balance out and round off the volume of a sound, and I think that can be really powerful. I'm going to find a pretty dynamic loop. Cool, so this is a great example. This is a completely unprocessed sample. This is very dynamic, very out of control. And there's, we can have a much more balanced and a balanced volume level, and we can save some headroom by just shaving off the peaks. So let me show you kind of a nice gentle way of doing it. What I like to do is look at the waveform, find where things are getting absolute loudest. So the biggest peak is right here. There's also a bunch of big peaks around here. So let's deal with these. And what we're going to do is I want some compressor settings that just kind of start to tickle the mix. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to slightly turn up the ratio, and I'm going to bring down the threshold just until we start gain reducing. And then I'm going to start dealing with the other settings.
¿Quieres? Vente a Sayulita, después de ahí nos vamos pa Punta de Mita. La diversión de eso yo no estoy harto, me voy para Vallarta a cotorrearla un rato, me doy un trago de beer. Tú sabes, Summer MC. Me escuchan, dicen yes, aquí se dice que sí, pero este vato no para el frenesí.
So notice how I'm letting the gain reduction come back. I don't want it to always be reducing the gain. I want to just be really grabbing onto those peaks. And then what I like to do is just play with the attack and release to feel, as well as the knee. Do I want this to be really smooth and creamy? Do I want it to be really aggressive and chunky? And I usually like a little bit of look ahead, so we're gonna add some look ahead. I'm gonna go for a nice kind of creamy, a bit of a bigger knee. And let's start to deal with that.
¿Quieres? Vente a Sayulita, después de ahí nos vamos pa Punta de Mita. La diversión de eso yo no estoy harto, me voy para Vallarta a cotorrearla un rato, me doy un trago de beer. Tú sabes, Summer MC.
See, and to me, this is already feeling just a lot more well-rounded. You're not having these big peaks and these big blasts, which, on an isolated sound or a sound for film or video games might be really cool. But for music, you don't really want things jumping out at you tremendously. That's just going to be suddenly taking over the mix and taking up a lot of headroom. And you usually want things to be kind of well-rounded. Now, alternatively, I'm going to contradict myself here. Let's say hypothetically I did want to smash this, because this can be a good way to take peaks and just have a really strong average volume for the sound. So what I like to do for that is, this is actually where a limiter comes into play, and I just use a limiter like a really aggressive compressor. Now another thing I might do is, in this case you'll notice this sound is panned heavily to the right, and I might want to unlink the left and right and actually limit them differently. It'll offset the stereo field, but it'll deal with the peaks separately. And what I like to do is up the gain or turn down the ceiling until we start to just reduce the gain.
En Canadá está reventándose, men. Tú no sabes que nosotros aquí somos buenos free. Estamos cric cric. Y si tú quieres, vente a Sayulita. Después de ahí nos vamos pa Punta de Mita. La diversión de eso yo no estoy harto. Me voy para Vallarta a cotorrearla un rato. Me doy.
Now you notice that this really takes away a lot of the feel. So for a sound like this, it might not be good, but I quite often like to use a limiter like Pro Q or Pro L2 on my bass group, my drum group, and really just kind of push things aggressively, deal with peaks, increase the overall average volume, and just, save yourself headroom in the group, but overall the kind of loudness of the track can increase because things are a little more squished and aggressive. Next up I want to talk about is distortion or saturation. So distortion or saturation, what it does is it introduces harmonics into the sound while essentially limiting it if you have some sort of hard clipper where you don't let the sound go past a certain range. Let me show you what that's like on a sine wave. So if we had operator, and let's have it peak at exactly 0 dB. Let's drop a scope onto here again. And let's put Ableton's saturator before it. So what I'm going to do is you'll notice even immediately, just turning soft clip on, we introduce a little bit of square harmonics. See how this starts to get a little chunkier? Now, obviously, this is an insane example. But what we're doing is essentially we're saving headroom, because we're turning this up tremendously, by changing the shape of the wave. So it's kind of limiting how much it can turn up. And then at a certain point, the waveform starts to change in shape because it can't go past a certain point, and it's louder for a longer period of time. See how this is pushing air for a longer period of time than the sine wave, which is only at peak volume for a shorter amount of time. So what this is doing is it's essentially louder more often. Now, you don't always want to go for something absolutely insane, but even just introducing it can change the headroom. So what I like to do is use Ableton's saturator, or you can use other distortions or saturators to save headroom. So what I like to do is I'll take something like a limiter, and let's see how far we have to turn down the ceiling before we start reducing gain.
En Canadá está reventándose.
So notice at 6 dB at -6 is where we start to hit a ceiling. So that means we have to turn this up 6 dB before we really start to shape that waveform. So I'm going to turn on the clipping, and I'm going to start to drive this sound.
En Canadá está reventándose.
Now what I do is any amount I turn up, I compensate by turning down.
En Canadá está reventándose, men, tú no sabes que nos...
So what we're doing is we're squaring off those peaks. We're adding kind of distortion and harmonics into it. But the nice thing is Ableton's saturator is quite transparent. When you do it gently, you don't hear it tremendously. And let's see what our peak volume is, how it's changing. So,
En Canadá está reventándose, men, tú no sabes que nosotros aquí...
So some of our peaks went up as high as -2.9.
En Canadá está reventándose, men, tú no sabes que nosotros aquí somos buenos free, estamos cri cri.
And nothing went over -10 there because it can't. It just physically can't. Let's crank this. Now this is going to sound bad, but I want to show you how extreme it can get.
En Canadá está reventándose, men, tú no sabes que nosotros aquí somos buenos free, estamos cri cri. En Canadá está reventándose, men, tú no...
Notice how that's perceptually very similar, but there's literally a 10 decibel difference in peak volume. Now, I'm not going to say you're always going to want to do this because you can hear it's starting to get a little chunky. You can hear the distortion, but there's definitely a happy medium. And I love to do this. Like, let's go back several steps. Let's go back to our clap. I love to do this to shave off a little bit of dB here and there on sounds where it can spare it. So let's listen to our claps all together, and I'm actually going to remove the gates. So everything's full transient value. Let's not worry about the kick right now. Let's listen to all 3 claps, and let's look at the peak volume. So my master right now is peaking at about -7. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to group these as if they were my snare group. Let's add the saturator on here. Let's add 6 dB, or let's even do 8 dB. We'll subtract 8 after. Soft clip, and now let's see where our headroom's at. So we've saved 2 more dB of headroom. Let's see how different it sounds. I can't really hear a difference. Granted, I'm kind of on shitty headphones right now. Pretty similar to me, and that's saving 2 decibels of peak volume. Let's see how far we can push it. So that's kind of starting to take away from the sound. Yeah, now it's starting to take away from it quite a bit. But even then, that's a 3 dB difference. That's 3 dB every other kick that is being saved in the overall peak volume, which is going to affect how it ends up hitting mastering and the compressors and the limiters at the end. So yeah, I really like using Ableton Saturator and just saturation and distortion in general. It's just a kind of a less is more situation, but it can save you a lot of headroom. Next, I just want to talk about dealing with masking subtractively. And I'm just going to talk to you guys about this. I'm not going to show you. But what I mean is in a mix, when you have two sounds that fill out similar frequency ranges, something I see a lot of newer producers do is they'll try to compensate by turning up frequencies in a sound instead of turning down frequencies in another sound. I think it's just often better in a mix to just be turning down to let other things shine instead of turning something up to force it through the mix. It's not really solving a problem, and that's just gonna have you turning up headroom overall. So whenever possible, when elements are masking each other in a mix, I just recommend EQing subtractively to fit those together and solve that problem. Extending on that is my next point, which is just really thinking about elements in terms of the three dimensions of the mix, which is tall, deep, and wide, or at least I call those the 3-dimension of the mix in terms of making something 3D. Obviously, there's other dimensions, dynamics, etc. But when it comes to slotting elements in a mix, I really want you to think about tall, deep, and wide, because when you think of your song as having this space, you have a lot more room to work with, headroom to work with, when you're putting elements in different positions in that space. So deep is how, what elements are using time-based effects like reverb and delay to be set forward and back in the mix. Wide is, stereo effects like the Haas effect, as well as panning, things like that, or how mono something is. And tall is what I usually consider to be EQing. EQing affects the height of a sound. And so when it comes to saving headroom in regards to these dimensions, sometimes if two elements are masking each other and they're using up a lot of the mix, maybe if you change where something sits in that dimension, it will stand out more in the mix while using the same amount or sometimes less amount of headroom. So if you have two mono sounds and they're really fighting for focus, but then you kind of make something a little wider and then suddenly they have this space to fit together, you're maybe using a similar amount of headroom, maybe more because stereo effects tend to use more headroom in a mix, but you have this space and therefore you might be able to save a bit of headroom there because you don't have to make everything as loud to stand out in the mix. So really consider the tall, deep, and wide dimensions of your mix. And then lastly, this last tip's kind of a cheat one. I should have called this 9 tips, but I'm going to use this one anyways and call it a nice even 10. And it's really consider the source sound you are using. And this kind of ties in everything we were talking about. When you're using kick drums, when you're using snares, bass sounds, whatever it is, sometimes a sound can use up a lot of headroom because it was poorly made. So you want to be cognizant of all the other steps, even when you're picking samples. You want to be seeing what samples right off the bat are just bad for your headroom. And I'm usually doing this very early on with my kick drum, my snare drum, and my sub bass, because those are really big culprits for, taking up a lot of headroom, especially kick and sub and how they interact. So I'm being very careful with those source sounds from the get-go, especially kick samples, because bass you usually make so you can kind of design where the phase is, but kicks you really want to be careful with what samples you're picking. It could be an awfully designed kick even if it sounds kind of cool. So just be cognizant of what samples you're using, how they're affecting the headroom of your mix, and maybe you have to do a little bit of polishing to them before you even start using it because maybe there's a problem with them. Or maybe you don't even use it at all because it's just a total headroom gobbler of a sound. So there we go, guys. That was 10 different tips you can use to start saving headroom in your mix. And saving headroom in your mix and just having more energy to work with, or having sounds be more efficient with energy so that your mix can be louder overall. I hope you guys liked this video, and I'll be back with another one soon. Peace.